What happens when the most ruthless man in Chicago discovers his lowest-ranking servant pocketing cold scraps? Bloodshed is the usual answer. But when Dominic Caruso tracked his overweight, terrified maid into the city's darkest slums, the sight waiting inside her crumbling apartment shattered his entire empire in seconds. Dominic Caruso did not become the head of the Chicago syndicate by letting thieves breathe. He was a man composed of cold calculation and brutal efficiency. From his third-floor mahogany study, surrounded by the faint scent of Cuban cigars and expensive bourbon, he ruled his empire with an iron fist. On this particular Friday night, the sprawling Caruso estate in Lake Forest was winding down from a massive syndicate gathering. The dining hall downstairs was a graveyard of opulence, half-eaten prime rib-silver platters smeared with caviar, and half-empty bottles of wine that cost more than most people made in a year. Down in the massive industrial-grade kitchen, the cleanup crew was working in exhausted silence. Among them was Beatrice Gallagher. Beatrice was not like the other women who occupied Dominic's world. In a sphere dominated by sleek, surgically enhanced beauties and trim, invisible staff, Beatrice stood out. She was a fat, heavy-set woman of 27, carrying the kind of weight that made her the butt of cruel jokes whispered in the staff corridors. Her standard grey uniform had to be special ordered, the seams constantly stretched across her broad shoulders and wide hips. Her thick dark hair was always plastered to her forehead with sweat from the grueling physical labor. She breathed heavily as she hauled massive trash bags and scrubbed cast-iron pans, her heavy feet aching in cheap non-slip shoes. She was slow, but she was meticulous, and more importantly, she was entirely invisible to the men in tailored suits who walked past her, or so she thought. Dominic was staring at the wall of security monitors in his study. His right-hand man, Lorenzo, stood by the door. Dominic's dark eyes lazily scanned the glowing screens until they locked onto camera 4, positioned perfectly above the walk-in refrigerator. On the screen, Beatrice was wiping down a massive steel prep table. She paused, looking nervously over her thick shoulder. The kitchen manager had just stepped out for a smoke break. Beatrice's large hands, red and blistered from hot water, reached out. She wasn't reaching for a cleaning rag. She was pulling a flattened plastic Tupperware container from the deep pockets of her oversized apron. Dominic leaned forward, resting his chin on his steepled fingers. With frantic, trembling movements, the fat maid began shoveling the discarded leftovers into the container. Slices of rare Wagyu beef, a handful of roasted asparagus, a heavy scoop of truffle mashed potatoes. She didn't eat a single bite herself. She just packed it in her heavy chest, heaving with terrified breaths, tears welling in her eyes as she forced the lid shut. She then slipped the bulky container deep into the lining of her oversized winter coat, hanging by the pantry door. "Do you see this, boss?" Lorenzo growled, stepping up behind Dominic's leather chair. "The fat cow is stealing from your kitchen. It's a matter of principle. You want me to take her down to the basement? Nobody steals from the Carusos. Not $1 million, not a piece of meat." Dominic watched the screen. He watched the way Beatrice wiped her sweating face, the sheer, unadulterated terror radiating from her bulky frame. She wasn't a spy. She wasn't a rival cartel plant. She was a frightened woman risking a bullet to the back of the head for cold potatoes and beef. "No." Dominic said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded instant obedience. "Leave her. Boss with disrespect if the staff finds out she's pocketing. I said no. Lorenzo." Dominic interrupted his eyes, never leaving the monitor. "A rat steals because it's in its nature. A human steals out of desperation. I want to know what makes a woman terrified of her own shadow risk my wrath for a pound of leftover steak." Lorenzo shifted uncomfortably. "You want me to tail her? Cancel my midnight meeting with the Russians?" Dominic said, standing up and grabbing his black wool overcoat. He checked the magazine of his customized Glock 19 before sliding it into his shoulder holster. "I'm going for a drive." Downstairs, Beatrice's shift finally ended at 1 a.m. She clocked out, wrapping her massive, worn-out coat around her heavy body. She kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with the security guards at the service gate. Every step she took felt like moving through molasses. Her heart hammered against her ribs, her breath pluming in the freezing November air. If they caught her, she knew what these men did. She had scrubbed blood off the basement floor before. She knew the penalty for disrespecting the Caruso family. But as she clutched the cold plastic container through her coat pocket, her jaw set with a fierce maternal determination. She had no choice. She walked out of the wrought-iron gates, her heavy frame trudging toward the bus stop at the edge of the affluent neighborhood. A block away, the engine of a sleek, black, unmarked SUV purred to life. Dominic Caruso sat behind the wheel, the headlights killed, blending perfectly into the shadows. He watched the heavy woman stand shivering under the flickering street lamp, and as the late-night city bus hissed to a stop, Dominic slipped the SUV into drive and began the hunt. The bus ride took Beatrice far away from the manicured lawns and towering mansions of Lake Forest. Dominic hung back, staying 2 cars behind the bus as it rattled its way toward the south side of Chicago. He watched the scenery shift from sprawling estates to gentrified apartments, and finally into the forgotten, rotting teeth of the city. This was a neighborhood the police avoided after dark. Broken streetlights cast long, jagged shadows over roads filled with potholes and shattered glass. Boarded-up storefronts and dilapidated tenements lined the streets. It was an area claimed by a rival, low-level street gang, a place where a man in a $3,000 suit, driving a luxury SUV, was begging to be carjacked. Dominic didn't care. His hand rested casually near his holster, his focus entirely on the bus. Finally, the brake lights flared. The pneumatic doors hissed open, and Beatrice stepped off. She looked worse than before. The freezing wind whipped at her thin coat, but she didn't button it. She kept her arms wrapped tightly around her midsection, guarding the stolen food like it was made of gold. Dominic parked the SUV in the shadow of a condemned warehouse, killed the engine, and stepped out into the biting cold. He followed her on foot. He was a phantom, his footsteps completely silent on the frozen concrete, a stark contrast to the heavy, dragging scuffs of Beatrice's cheap shoes. He stayed 50 yards back, slipping between alleyways and parked husks of stolen cars. He watched her heavy, exhausted body navigate the treacherous ice. At one point, a pair of junkies stepped out from an alley eyeing her. Beatrice didn't cower. She suddenly stood taller, her broad shoulders squaring, and she reached into her pocket, gripping something hard, perhaps a box cutter. She gave them a look of such feral, desperate warning that the men backed off, muttering curses. Dominic's eyebrows rose slightly. Interesting, he thought. The trembling, sweating maid in his kitchen was suddenly a lioness in the slums. Beatrice finally turned into the courtyard of a crumbling 6-story brick tenement building. The front door was missing entirely, the hinges rusted and broken. She hauled herself up the concrete steps, her breathing heavy and labored. Dominic waited until she disappeared into the dark stairwell before he approached. He slipped inside the building. The air smelled of damp mold, stale urine, and boiled cabbage. He heard her heavy, rhythmic footsteps ascending. 2nd floor, 3rd floor, 4th floor. She was slow, having to stop and catch her breath, leaning her heavy weight against the rotting banisters. Dominic moved like a shadow up the stairs, closing the distance. By the time she reached the 5th floor, he was only a half flight behind her, hidden in the pitch-black curve of the landing. He heard a key scrape into a rusted lock. A heavy door creaked open. "I'm home, baby." Beatrice's voice echoed out, completely stripped of the fearful stutter she used at the mansion. It was warm, exhausted, and dripping with love. "I brought you something amazing." Dominic crept up to the 5th-floor landing. The door to apartment 5B was shut, but it was incredibly flimsy. The lock was cheap, barely hanging on to the splintered doorframe. Dominic could easily kick it down. Instead, he pulled out a specialized set of lockpicks from his inner coat pocket. He wasn't here to murder her. He was here to uncover the truth. He waited 3 minutes, listening to the muffled sounds of movement inside. Then, with practiced silent precision, he slid the picks into the keyhole. It took him 4 seconds to bypass the cheap mechanism. He turned the knob with agonizing slowness, pushing the door open just a fraction of an inch to peer inside. The apartment was freezing. There was no heating. A single bare light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a harsh yellow glare over peeled wallpaper and a rotting linoleum floor. In the corner of the small room was a tiny electric space heater, glowing bright orange, aimed directly at a ragged mattress on the floor. Beatrice was kneeling beside the mattress. She had taken off her coat and was shivering in her tight, sweaty uniform. She had opened the stolen Tupperware container, and the smell of expensive Wagyu beef and truffles filled the squalid room. But it wasn't the food that made Dominic Caruso freeze. It wasn't the extreme poverty. It wasn't the heavy-set maid weeping softly as she laid out the cold meat. Dominic's eyes locked onto the figure sitting on the mattress, and his heart, a muscle that had pumped ice water for the last 10 years, violently stopped. Sitting on the bed was a little girl no older than 6. She was painfully thin, her skin pale, wrapped in a threadbare blanket. But that wasn't what paralyzed the Mafia Boss. The little girl had striking, piercing violet eyes, a genetic rarity that belonged exclusively to the Caruso bloodline. Dominic had those eyes. His father had those eyes. And more importantly, dangling from the little girl's frail neck was a heavy silver medallion. It was a custom-made, solid silver pendant depicting St. Jude, deeply engraved with a specific family crest. It was the exact necklace Dominic's younger sister Isabella was wearing the night she was kidnapped and supposedly murdered by a rival cartel 7 years ago. The cartel had sent back a finger with Isabella's ring on it, but her body was never found. "Eat, sweetie," Beatrice cooed, her large hands gently stroking the little girl's dark hair. "I promised you I'd get you something good today. Mama B promised." The little girl coughed a deep, rattling sound in her small chest and looked up at Beatrice with those unmistakable violet eyes. "Did the scary men at the big house hurt you today, Mama B?" "No, my angel," Beatrice lied, her voice cracking as a single tear rolled down her plump, exhausted cheek. "They didn't even notice me. I'm invisible." Outside the door, Dominic Caruso, the untouchable ghost of the Chicago underworld, stood frozen in the dark. His hand trembled as it hovered over his gun. The world as he knew it had just been violently ripped apart, leaving him staring at the impossible ghost of his own bloodline, kept alive by the very woman he had almost ordered killed. Dominic's heavy leather boot pushed the splintered door open. The rusted hinges let out a high-pitched squeal that cut through the freezing apartment like a siren. Beatrice whipped around. When she saw the towering, broad-shouldered silhouette of the most dangerous man in Chicago filling her doorway, the color drained entirely from her face. She didn't scream. Her maternal instincts overrode her sheer terror. With startling speed for a woman of her size, she threw her massive body over the little girl, entirely shielding the frail child beneath her thick gray uniform. She reached blindly onto the floor, her trembling hand snatching the cheap metal box cutter she carried for the streets. "Don't you touch her!" Beatrice roared, her voice a guttural, desperate snarl. Tears streamed down her flushed, plump cheeks, but her eyes burned with the ferocity of a cornered bear. "You kill me. You kill me first, you monster." Dominic didn't draw his weapon. He slowly raised his empty hands, stepping fully into the harsh yellow light of the bare bulb. His dark eyes were wide, fixed not on the fat, sweating maid who had stolen his prime rib, but on the sliver of the little girl's face peering out from beneath Beatrice's heavy arm. "That necklace," Dominic whispered, his voice cracking entirely stripped of its usual deadly gravel. "Where did you get that silver medallion?" Beatrice gripped the box cutter so hard her knuckles turned white. "Get out." Her eyes. Dominic continued, taking a slow, trembling step forward. The untouchable boss of the Caruso syndicate fell to his knees on the rotting linoleum, heedless of the filth. "Those are the Caruso eyes. She looks exactly like Isabella." At the sound of that name, Beatrice froze. Her heavy chest heaved her breath, pluming in the freezing air. She stared at the hardened mobster, looking for a trick, a trap. But there was no deception in Dominic's face. There was only raw, unadulterated agony and impossible hope. "Her name is Sophia," Beatrice said, her voice shaking violently. She didn't lower the blade. "Isabella named her Sophia." Dominic buried his face in his hands, letting out a ragged, tearing sound that no man in his syndicate had ever heard. It was the sound of a 10-year-old wound being ripped wide open. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet. "Isabella is alive. Where is she?" Beatrice's fierce expression softened into profound sorrow. She slowly sat up, though she kept one heavy arm protectively wrapped around Sophia. The little girl clutched Beatrice's apron, staring at the crying giant in the expensive suit. "Isabella is gone, Mr. Caruso," Beatrice whispered gently. "She passed away 6 years ago. I was with her." Dominic let out a shuddering breath, the faint hope extinguishing, replaced instantly by a desperate need for the truth. "Tell me. Everything." Beatrice lowered the box cutter, her hands trembling as she stroked Sophia's dark hair. 7 years ago, I wasn't a cleaner. I was a night shift nurse's aide at St. Bernard Hospital down in Englewood. One night, a woman was dumped at the emergency room doors. She was severely beaten, malnourished, and heavily pregnant. It was your sister. Dominic's jaw clenched, his knuckles turning white, as he imagined the horrors Isabella had endured at the hands of the rival cartel. She was terrified. Beatrice continued, tears spilling over her full cheeks. She refused to give the doctors her real name. But she bonded with me. I think she felt safe, because I was just the big, quiet girl who changed her bandages. When she went into early labor, her heart gave out. She knew she wasn't going to survive the night. Before she slipped away, she pressed that silver medallion into my hand and begged me to take her baby. "Why didn't you bring her to me?" Dominic demanded, his voice thick with a mixture of anger and grief. "You lived in this squalor, starving, stealing scraps, when you could have brought her to her family. I would have given you millions. Because she told me not to." Beatrice fired back, her protective rage flaring again. "Isabella told me, the night she was kidnapped, it was an inside job. Someone in your inner circle sold her to the cartel. She said if I brought the baby to the Caruso estate, the mole would find out she survived, and they would slaughter the child to cover their tracks." Dominic felt the blood turn to ice in his veins. A mole. Someone he trusted had handed his beloved sister over to the wolves. "So I took her," Beatrice sobbed, looking down at the squalid room. "I forged the hospital records to say the baby died with the mother. I quit my career. I moved to the slums where Nobody from your world would ever look. And I took a job scrubbing floors in your kitchen." Dominic stared at the heavy-set woman, his mind reeling. "You purposely infiltrated my estate. I needed to know who it was," Beatrice said, her dark eyes flashing with a brilliant calculating intelligence that completely belied her unassuming appearance. "I'm fat, Mr. Caruso. I'm fat, slow, and ugly. In a house full of rich, powerful men and beautiful women, I am entirely invisible. Nobody watches the fat maid emptying the trash. Nobody stops talking when I scrub the baseboards." Dominic was awestruck. This woman, mocked by his guards and ignored by his capos, was a master operative, hiding in plain sight, enduring grueling labor and poverty just to protect his niece. "Did you find them?" Dominic asked, his voice dropping to a lethal, terrifying whisper. "Did you find the rat?" Beatrice nodded slowly. "I take out the garbage from the executive wing every Tuesday night. 3 times I've seen him intercepting the waste management trucks. He's not tossing trash. He's exchanging encrypted phones and taking manila envelopes from the cartel drivers." "Who?" "The man who stands at your door," Beatrice said, without hesitation. "Lorenzo." The fallout was completely silent and absolutely merciless. Dominic did not return to the Lake Forest mansion that night. Instead, he made a single encrypted phone call to his most fiercely loyal enforcer, a scarred veteran named Matteo. Within 45 minutes, a trio of heavily armored SUVs descended upon the crumbling tenement. Beatrice and Sophia were wrapped in thick, heated wool blankets and ushered out of the freezing slums forever. They were driven straight to a heavily guarded $50 million penthouse in Chicago's elite Gold Coast district, a fortress known only to Dominic's absolute inner circle. For the first time in 6 years, Beatrice slept on a premium mattress in a room where the heat hummed steadily, keeping the bitter winter entirely at bay. The next evening, back at the sprawling Caruso estate, Lorenzo was summoned to the subterranean soundproof basement. He walked down the concrete steps, expecting to interrogate a captured smuggler from the rival Navarro cartel. Instead, he found Dominic sitting motionless in a cold steel chair in the center of the dimly lit room, slowly smoking a Cuban cigar. The heavy, reinforced iron door slammed shut and locked from the outside behind Lorenzo. Dominic didn't yell. He didn't pace. He simply reached into his tailored jacket and tossed a thick, heavy manila envelope onto the blood-stained concrete floor. It burst open upon impact, spilling out dozens of high-resolution photographs Beatrice had meticulously snapped with a cheap burner phone over the last 2 years. They were undeniable, damning images of Lorenzo intercepting waste management trucks, taking thick envelopes of cash and exchanging burner phones with Navarro cartel drivers. "Boss, wait, I can explain everything." Lorenzo stammered, his face instantly draining of all color as he backed against the cold wall. "It's a setup. You called her a fat cow." Dominic interrupted softly, his violet eyes completely devoid of mercy or warmth. "You said she was stealing scraps from my kitchen. You demanded I punish her. But that invisible, heavy-set woman was the only person in this entire empire carrying the true weight of loyalty." The gunshot that followed was deafening in the concrete room, echoing the absolute finality of Dominic's wrath. With the syndicate brutally purged of its rot, Dominic turned his entire focus to the penthouse. He visited every single day. At first, it was solely to bond with his niece. He flooded the safe house with expensive toys, hired top-tier pediatric specialists like Dr. Harrison to heal Sophia's damaged lungs, and provided an abundance of fierce protective love that he had buried for a decade. But as the weeks melted into months, Dominic found his gaze lingering less on the recovering child and entirely on Beatrice. In his ruthless high society world, women were treated like currency. They were sleek, sharp-edged, surgically perfected trophies, who smiled with cold, calculating eyes. Beatrice was the total, breathtaking antithesis. She was deeply soft, unapologetically thick, with wide hips, heavy thighs, and a loud, warm laugh that brought actual life to the sterile penthouse. She didn't care about his offshore accounts or his lethal reputation. She openly scolded him when he tracked city snow onto her freshly vacuumed rugs, and she spent hours cooking enormous, rich, soul-warming meals from scratch, fiercely banning his hired private chefs from entering her kitchen. One evening, Dominic walked into the penthouse dining room after a brutal day of syndicate negotiations. Beatrice was standing at the stove, humming softly. She was wearing a soft, emerald-green silk dress he had secretly ordered a master tailor to custom-make for her exact measurements. The luxurious fabric draped beautifully over her heavy curves, highlighting the thick, maternal grace that had saved his bloodline. He walked up behind her silently, wrapping his strong, muscular arms securely around her broad waist. Beatrice stiffened instantly, the wooden spoon pausing in the simmering pot of marinara. "Dominic," she whispered, her plump cheeks flushing a deep, embarrassed red. She instinctively tried to pull her stomach, in her old insecurities flaring. "What are you doing? I'm a mess right now, and I'm too big for you to be holding me like this." "You are exactly the size you were always meant to be," Dominic murmured, his voice a low, vibrating rumble against her back. He refused to let her pull away, burying his face in the warm crook of her neck, breathing in the intoxicating scent of garlic vanilla and the extraordinary woman who had brought his dead soul back to life. Every single pound, every curve. It is a beautiful testament to the space you take up in this world. You are a fortress, Beatrice. Your body sheltered my blood when my entire empire couldn't. Beatrice's breath caught sharply in her throat. She had spent her entire adult life shrinking, apologizing for her sheer mass, hiding her heavy frame in oversized coats and unflattering industrial aprons. But wrapped in the unyielding arms of the most feared man in the city, she didn't feel monstrous, clumsy, or unwanted. She felt revered. She felt like a goddess. He turned her around gently, taking her red, calloused hands in his manicured ones, lifting them to press a tender kiss to her knuckles. "I don't want you to ever hide again, Beatrice. Not from the world, and definitely not from me," he stated, looking deep into her tear-filled eyes. "I want you permanently by my side. Not as a maid. Not as a hidden savior in a safe house." He brushed a tear from her full cheek. "As my absolute equal. As my wife." Tears streamed freely down Beatrice's face, not born of terror or exhaustion, but of profound, overwhelming joy. She nodded, pulling the terrifying Mafia Boss down into a fierce, consuming kiss. 6 months later, the elite Chicago underworld was formally introduced to the new matriarch of the Caruso family. The grand gilded ballroom of the historic Drake Hotel was packed with corrupt politicians, hardened capos, and international business moguls. The room fell into a stunned, absolute silence when Dominic Caruso descended the grand marble staircase, tightly holding the hand of his bride. Beatrice wore a breathtaking, custom-tailored black velvet gown that hugged her heavy, gorgeous figure with unapologetic pride. Around her thick neck rested a string of priceless, flawless diamonds, and by her side walked a healthy, glowing little girl with striking violet eyes. The sleek, starving socialites in the room stared in shock, but Beatrice did not shrink. She walked with her head held high, her broad shoulders squared, projecting immense, undeniable power. She was no longer the invisible fat maid scrubbing floors in the dark. She was the immovable, fiercely loved queen of the Caruso Empire, a woman who had conquered the deadliest underworld in the country, not with bullets, but with stolen scraps of meat, a cheap box cutter, and an unwavering, beautiful heart. Did this incredible story of sacrifice, loyalty, and unexpected romance leave you breathless? Beatrice proved that true beauty and immense power come from the heart, not outward appearances. If you loved seeing this fiercely protective maid transform into the ultimate mafia queen, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this jaw-dropping story with your friends and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling real-life dramas and epic plot twists. See you in the next video.